Khan Academy's Year 8 lesson about the suffragists. Now, you should have already completed a starter activity as part of the team's live introduction. Thank you so much if you've already contributed during that time. Now, just to remind you all that we're starting our next topic, which is 1900 society. We've just finished our topic on slavery to freedom, and you've all tried really hard with that. I hope that you're going to enjoy our next topic equally. Now, in terms of the next topic, as it's the 1900 society, we're going to start by looking at the suffragists and the suffragettes and their methods and their actions that helped women achieve the rights to vote. Now, essentially, this will then guide us into the First World War, as the suffragists and suffragettes were largely active in the years just before that time. So let's make a start on this lesson. Remember to pause this video where I ask you to in order to complete the tasks. And remember that your teachers will be live during the lesson as well, and you can go back to Teams to ask them questions at any point if you need to. So I want you to start off Year 8 by writing down today's title. How significant were the suffragists? You may want to pause this slide just for a second so you can get that title down. So before we start looking at the actions and methods of the suffragists in today's lesson and the suffragettes in our next lesson, I want us to start by thinking about why this campaign began for women to gain the right to vote. Because although this campaign was largely about getting women the right to vote, it was about many other rights too. At this period of time, in the 19th century in particular, women were seen as second-class citizens. I want you to find out a little bit more about the situation for women in England and why this needed to change. Now, I want us to start by watching this good video. There's a link on this slide here, but obviously you can't click on it. So what I'd like you to do is either go to show my homework, or the same link can also be found in the description box on YouTube that you're watching right now. So either one is fine. It's the same link. You just need to click on that link and watch that short video. Whilst you're watching the video, I would like you to answer these 3 questions that I've just located on the left here. So first of all, I'd like to find out a bit more about what does this video tell us about the situation for women. You might want to make some bullet pointed notes about what it tells us about women's rights at this time and why things needed to change. I also want you to find out about some key individuals that are involved, names of important characters that were involved in leading this movement. And I also want you to find out about the different groups that led the protest for rights for women. And remember, guys, that this video is just an introduction. So although I would like you to answer these questions, you don't need to do it in lots and lots of detail, because we are going to find out more about these individuals and these groups over the next 2 lessons. But I would like you to make sure that you get something down for these 3 questions as a starting point. So watch this video, make some notes, and come back to this afterwards. So after watching that video, you should have picked up on a few things already about what life was like for women at the start of the 19th century. One thing you should have definitely understood from that video is that women and men were not considered to be equal in the 19th century. Women were definitely seen as the weaker sex. And this could be seen when the video talked about how women were considered second-class citizens. This meant that women were not considered to be equal to men. Instead, some people believed that women had smaller brains than men and were in some cases to be seen similar to children. And this is one of the reasons why women didn't have the right to vote, because at this time people believed that women were too emotional and were not capable of making difficult political decisions. It's important we also know that at this time, the middle classes in particular did take the role of women quite seriously. So, for example, the ideal woman was supposed to be the angel of the house, someone that supports their husband, keeps their home tidy, and makes sure that the children are well cared for. So it's important that women had a role, we understand that women had a role in society, but that this role was very isolated and different to men, and women were not expected to branch outside of that role. In the video, it also talked about rights for married women. So particularly when it came to things like property and earnings, women were expected to give up those things to their husband once they were married. You can also see on my slide here, I've given you a little bit more information about the rights for married women. I would like you to make sure that when I finish talking, make a few notes about the rights for married women here. So for example, it talks about another quite shocking thing here, about how when it came to things like the right to divorce, was also quite difficult. Now, in terms of divorce, it was quite unfashionable in these days anyway. But the thing that I think is quite shocking is that men had the right to divorce their wives for a variety of reasons. Now, of course, people today have the right to divorce for whatever reason they choose. But in these days, men had the right to divorce their wives for whatever reason, such as, for example, failing to meet their needs or committing adultery, let's say their wife had cheated on them with somebody else, then they had the right to divorce their wife. But it wasn't until halfway through the century, 1857, that a woman could actually divorce an abusive husband. So what that tells us is that even in the law, when it came to marriage, things were not equal, and rights for women were definitely considered to be not equal to those of men. Now, the other thing I'd like you to look at is working women, and what rights did they have? It's important we know that women at this stage were not really expected to work. There were some industries that women did definitely dominate. So, for example, the textiles industry was quite reliant upon the labour of women. But I'd like to look into these notes a bit more and find out about some of the other industries and areas that women worked in. One of the other things it does mention here is about politics and government. Of course, politics and government were considered to be matters for men. Women, as we've talked about, were believed to have smaller brains and did not have the same brain capacity to understand such things as politics and government. And so that's why women were entirely excluded from the process. Women could not vote, no matter who they were, whether they were rich or poor, and they had no women in Parliament whatsoever. So you couldn't have a female MP, and certainly not a female Prime Minister at this stage. Okay, so it's important we understand that women were definitely restricted when it came to politics. So what I'd like to do now, Year 8, is make some notes from these points I've just pointed out for you here. You will want to use these same subheadings, so rights for married women and rights for working women. I'd like just to make a few notes from these bullet points. Remember, you don't have to write down every word. You can shorten down these points. You can turn them into your own words to shorten them down. You can pick out just key points if you'd like to. I would like to make notes on both of these sections. Okay, Year 8, so now we've finished looking at what life was like for women in the 19th century and what rights women had. I'd like us to look at the suffragists and what they did to try and bring equality for women, particularly in politics. First thing I'd like to do is to write down a subheading as the suffragists, and I would also like you to write down the definition of what a suffragist is. So a suffragist is a person who advocates peacefully that the right to vote should be extended to women. Now, it's something I wanted to point out to you is that suffragists and suffragettes are called that because they are fighting for the right to vote. And the word suffrage means the right to vote, and that's why they're called the suffragists and suffragettes. So the suffragists is who we're going to look at first, our first group, and they are led by a lady called Millicent Fawcett. So you can see her in this picture here. The second picture that you can see just below is the picture of Millicent's statue in London. Because after a campaign and a petition, the statue was created to basically remember the work of Millicent Fawcett and how she had dedicated her life to fighting for women's rights to vote. So she now has a statue that you can actually visit in London. It shows us that she's a very significant and remembered individual that's part of this movement. Now, over the next couple of slides, we're going to read more about the suffragists. What I'd like you to do is read the information carefully and answer the questions in full sentences. Remember that full sentences are needed because then we can look back at our notes in the future and we know what it all means. If we just write the answer, we can get a little bit lost when we look back in the future. So make sure that you have done it in full sentences, and remember to pause the slides whilst you complete the task so that you can actually read the information carefully. Okay then, Year 8. So what I'd like you to do here is just read through this information that is about the suffragists, and then I would like you to answer these 4 questions that are available just below. Remember to answer in full sentences. All of the answers are available in the information here. We've been doing some comprehension recently in lesson, particularly we've looked at the different civil rights movement events. So I'd like you to have a go at doing this on your own. When you get to the end of the PowerPoint, I will go through the answers with you, and then we can just double check them at the end if you'd like to. Well done for completing the 4 comprehension questions, Year 8. What I'd like you to do is complete the final comprehension question, which is just here as number 5. The question is, how successful were the methods of the suffragists? For this one, I would like you to explain your answer using the information that you've read on both slides. So this is our final section where you need to read through the information and answer that final question. Again, the answer will be on the final slides, just so you can double check to see what you've put against mine. Okay, Ray, that brings us towards the end of our first lesson of the week. Well done for your notes on the rights of women in the 19th century and your work on the suffragists. Now, so far we have made some notes about the suffragists, and that includes looking at how successful they were. But as a last task and as a plenary for today's lesson, I do want you to have a go answering this question. Overall, how important do you think the suffragists were in helping to gain voting rights for women? So when we're asking ourselves about how important the suffragists were, we're thinking about a number of things. Were they important at the time? Are they important today on reflection? Do you think they're important because they influenced other women to get involved in the campaign? Do you think they were important because you think they were successful? Do you think that they were important because they started the suffrage campaign and other women were perhaps inspired to try other methods as a way of gaining rights for women to vote? It's up to you. You might think that they're very important. You might think they're quite important. You might think that they're not important at all. But I would like to have a go at writing your answer down as a paragraph or having a conversation about it with somebody at home if someone is available to chat to you about it right now. But remember, I would like to have an answer prepared for this because at the start of our second lesson of this week, during the live starter as we do the register, I would like you to share your opinion with your teacher and make sure that you mention to them whether you think the suffragists were very, quite, or not very important for gaining rights for women to vote. Thank you so much for your work today, Year 8. If you would like to check your answers for the comprehension questions for today, you can continue to watch the rest of the video. But if you're happy with your comprehension questions, you don't necessarily need to continue the video, but please do if you just want to check it to be sure. Thank you for your work, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the next lesson of the week. Okay, Year 8, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the answers for the comprehension task in case you'd like to check your answer and make sure you've got all the right answers. So first of all, question 1 was, who was Millicent Fawcett? You will be able to find your answer at the very beginning of the information here, where it talks about the fact that Millicent Fawcett was the founder of the National Union of Women's Suffrage. So that's all you needed to mention for who she was. And obviously you could maybe talk a bit about the fact that she was somebody that also believed in peaceful protest. That could be a bit about her as well and her work with the National Union of Women's Suffrage. So the National Union of Women's Suffrage, remember, was the suffragists. And we also know that the suffragists were more peaceful in their protest for women's rights to vote. So the second question is about why was Fawcett against the use of violent protest? So what was it about violent protest that she disagreed with? Well, in the information, it does talk about that she felt that any violence or trouble would actually persuade men that women could not be trusted to have the right to vote. So basically, she felt that actually by using violence and causing trouble in the streets, it would basically give people the ammunition to go against the rights for women to vote. And so it kind of played into the hands of those that opposed it. And that's one of the reasons that she was against it. So for number 3, what was Fawcett's argument for why women should be able to vote? So, for example, this one's quite long. It talks about the fact that Fawcett argued that women could hold responsible posts in society. So, for example, women were sitting on school boards. They couldn't be trusted to vote, which was strange. She argued that if Parliament were to make laws and if women had to obey these laws, then women should be part of the process of making laws. She argued that women had to pay taxes like men, so they should have the same rights. And one of her most powerful arguments was that wealthy mistresses of large manors and estates employed gardeners, workmen, and labourers who could vote, but the women could not, regardless of their wealth. So what that's trying to say is that basically Fawcett's main argument for why women should be able to vote is that women actually already had important roles in society, such as sitting on school boards. So they could be trusted to do that, but could not be trusted to vote, and she thought that that seemed unfair. She also believed that if women had to obey laws, then they should have a role in making those laws. Otherwise, I suppose what she's saying is, women have to obey laws, but if they have no role in making the law, then why should they have to accept the laws that are forced upon them? She also argued that if women had to pay taxes, then again, they should have a role in Parliament. So essentially, she has a number of different arguments there. You may have blended all 3 into one answer. You may have just mentioned one of those reasons, and that's absolutely fine. As long as you've given an argument for why Fawcett believed that women should be able to vote, then you would have a correct answer from that. Question number 4, what methods did the suffragists use? It's important to understand that the suffragists used peaceful methods and they were also law-abiding methods. What that means is that they kept within the law, did not do anything that broke the law, was considered to be vandalism or anything like that, or considered to be violent. Their methods were peaceful. So you will have written for your answer some examples of that, hopefully. So for example, petitions. Remember the petitions? We have talked about these before in lesson, but petitions basically is where a number of people have to get signatures basically to put forward an argument to Parliament. So for example, if somebody gets over a number of signatures, they can put that argument forward, Parliament has to discuss it. So they would have had a petition to say that women should get the right to vote, they get thousands of people to sign this petition, and then they get Parliament to discuss the matter. And they hope that Parliament will vote on that matter in their favour. They also held debates, speeches, and created posters to raise awareness of the cause. The women that were part of the suffragists would do public speeches and would stand in the streets and hand out leaflets and posters to raise awareness of the cause and get people to essentially join in with what they were trying to achieve. And they were also trying to convince people of their arguments. But remember, Fawcett believed that this was enough and that violent protests would not gain women the right to vote. She believed that instead that would push people away from the suffrage movement. So that's the answers for the first 4 questions. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see the answer for question 5. Okay guys, we're going to go through our final answer now for question 5. The question is, how successful were the methods of the suffragists? And we need to explain our answer. Overall, I would probably argue that suffragists were quite successful to an extent because they had basically started the suffrage movement, they'd started to gain more attention and recognition for the cause, they'd encouraged more women to join up and try to campaign for the rights of women to vote. But I would argue that they were not necessarily entirely successful because their progress was slow. So where it talks here about Fawcett's progress being slow, it means that although she was campaigning, women weren't getting the right to vote, and it didn't seem like they were going to get it anytime soon. So the progress was slow, and therefore I would argue she wasn't entirely successful in her campaign. However, the reason I would say that she is quite successful to an extent is that she did manage to convert some of the members of the Labour representation, which would eventually become the Labour Party. But unfortunately, most men in Parliament still believed that women simply would not understand how Parliament worked. So although she'd managed to convince some members of the Labour Party to join in her cause, basically most members of Parliament just weren't getting on board, and they simply believed that women were not intelligent enough to understand Parliament and therefore could not take part in the electoral process and should not be given the right to vote. So basically, I would argue that she was quite successful in gaining some recognition for the cause. She was quite successful in gaining members from the Labour Party to join her in her cause. However, overall, I would say she was not that successful because the progress was slow. But also, the other reason I would argue she was not that successful is because her lack of progress left many women feeling very angry. And that's when women began to join the next group in 1903, Women's Social and Political Union. Women's Social and Political Union is also known as the Suffragettes, and they were led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. These women believed that women needed the right to vote, and they were not prepared to wait. They were willing to use more violent and quite aggressive tactics to get women the right to vote, and they believed that Fawcett's process was slow, was not making the progress it needed to gain women's rights. So that's going to lead us on to our next lesson, where we're going to look at the suffragettes in more detail, and we're going to talk about Emmeline Pankhurst and what methods she used to get women the right to vote. Again, thank you for taking part in this lesson, Year 8, and I hope that you got all the right answers, and if not, feel free to adjust your answer in red pen if you need to. Thank you.